Hey guys, John here. Today we're going to be recreating that classic TB-303 acid sound that we all know and love in Pigments, so here we go. Alright, that was the patch. If you like the patch, give the video a thumbs up. It helps a lot with the channel, and also subscribe if you haven't already. So let's dive into this thing. So this one is made to be played easily. With that being said, we have three macros over here. We have the cutoff, the resonance, and the distortion. So if we go to the spot over here where everything kind of comes in here, take a look at how easy this is to play and kind of notice the different knobs I'm going to be playing around with. Like I said, we have the cutoff, the resonance, and the distortion. Alright, so hopefully you get the idea. With these three macros, you can really come up with a lot of different kind of possibilities within this patch. Keep in mind that this resonance knob, all the way at the top here, it's still not going to get into self-oscillation mode, so I kind of made sure that we didn't really pass that limit. So you can crank this all the way and it doesn't necessarily sound bad, it's just a little extreme. So it's almost right at that spot before it self-oscillates, but it's just not there. You can crank this up with a macro if you would like to, but that's kind of just how I set this up here. So let's dive into this thing and talk about this patch, because there's a couple different things that we need to talk about that really makes this sound this sound. So obviously, it's going to be a lot of the stuff happening in the sequencer. We're going to get to that, and then also the effects, which is kind of a lot going on here. So as with any patch, let's turn off the sequencer, let's turn off the effects, make sure that we don't have anything routed. We have a little bit of reverb, but we have that turned off right here because this is not yellow. So let's dive into the oscillator. So what we're going to be using is no utility engine, but we are using both engines. Engine 1's wavetable and engine 2 is analog. So if we just kind of played something like this, this is kind of the dry sound that we get just out of the synth itself with both engines going. Now let's turn off engine 2 analog and let's just look at this first wavetable right here. So this is the sound that we're going to be getting. Let's turn our resonance down because that's a lot of the filter influence there. Maybe put our cutoff kind of maybe here at noon, and maybe let's turn down our distortion for now. Doesn't necessarily matter because the FX are off, but just so we know that this is going to be down. So this is the sound that we're basically going to get. Now, this engine over here is going to be sent to filter 1, which we're going to talk about in just a minute here. So what you're looking at here is actually a saw wave initially, just a little bit of change here. So this skew is at 0.616, and this fold is at 3.86. So if we had this all the way down here and all the way down here, it would just be that saw wave on the basic shape. So if we click this toggle here, we can see that we are snapped to this saw wave here. So let's do an undo, get us back to where we were before. So this is going to be this initial engine here. We are going to be using some unison here on the voices, only 2, because we do want a little bit extra sound, another extra voice there. But we don't want it to overtake because this is a lead. If we have too many voices, it's going to kind of wash out the sound here. The stereo is all the way to the right at 100%, and the detune is actually kind of down at 0.459. So that's basically what's happening in the first engine here, the wavetable. So let's turn this one off, and then let's turn this engine 2 on. So the whole point with this one is on the original synth, you have a choice of saw wave, square wave, kind of mixing the two. So you're kind of bouncing between different waveforms. And that's what this is trying to do. So engine number 2, analog, we have 2 of these square waves, well, technically pulse waves. And this second oscillator, the width is at 0.895. So we're kind of changing the pulse width here, whereas the first one is going to be in the middle. So this width all the way down, so it's going to be 0.5. So the volume is going to be all the way at the top for both of these oscillators. And we kind of get that square sound here. Also using some unison 2 voices, and the detune is at 0.322, so a little bit less than the first one over here on this detune. And this is also going to filter number 1. So that's basically the oscillators, the initial sound generation part. Now for the contour, we're really going to be using this envelope VCA just to kind of get the sound in and out for appropriate amount of time. The rest is really going to be handled within the sequencer, and we'll see why in just a moment. But for the envelope VCA, the attack is at 0.5 milliseconds, decay 300 milliseconds. The decay curve is at 0.48. You might notice that this curve looks a little bit different here than your default curve. And the sustain 0.072, release 20 milliseconds. So that basically covers the oscillators and then the amplitude envelope here. So with both of these engaged, we have that going on. Now, some modulation that we do have is going to be this envelope number 2. So if we click inside here, we can see that this is assigned to the filter cutoff, so right over here. And we can see this where this orange is, where it's a little bit brighter. That's going to be the range that this is modulating in. So if we had our cutoff all the way down from this macro, we can see that this is the range that this is going to move at. Now this envelope 2 is not too crazy. The attack 1 millisecond, decay 500 milliseconds, sustain 0, release 100 milliseconds, and the curves should be probably default -2 for the decay, and then for the attack curve is at 0. So that's just the envelope working right there. Now, what we are going to be doing as well is a little bit of macros. So this is going to help make the synth a little bit easier to play and work with, and also to kind of have a nice range that sounds good, and we can have a lot of different timbres within our sound. So we're going to be using the filter MS-20, and this is basically a staple filter for this sound. It's not specifically the exact same filter from the original, but it's the closest I think we can get in Pigments. So with that being said, select the MS-20, the low pass 12. Now our resonance knob is kind of interesting because we have this knob all the way down for our macro that's controlling this resonance, but right now it is at 0.336. So we did increase it a little bit. And if we hover our mouse over this macro, we can see this little distance here that you're going to be looking at over the knob is the distance that this macro has to control. So as we move this macro, we can see that little blue light kind of going back and forth within that range. We can see the filter acting accordingly. Now, how do we do that? So we're just going to grab our macros, however we want to assign them, grab it, select it, and then we're just going to drop it onto a different knob, just how we do any other modulation. And from there, we can always put our mouse over here and click and drag depending on how much we want this influence to be. I always suggest to kind of turn your macro all the way to the bottom to the left, set your initial value, and then turn your macro all the way to the right, and then adjust here so you can kind of get a range of the minimum value and then the maximum value. You can kind of say, okay, this is exactly where I want to be for my macro, so on and so forth. Hopefully that makes some sense there. So that covers the oscillators, the envelope, and now our filter, which is kind of the staple of this sound. Now we can change these macros here. And the same goes for the cutoff. You can drag this macro over here when this is all the way to the bottom, and we can see the range that this has to play with. So right over here is going to be our max. And if we turn our cutoff all the way up here, we can now see that this is going to be the max value. And then our resonance as well. Now we kind of want to have that twangy sound right there. Now let's turn on our effects here, and now this is going to be mapped to the distortion, so let's kind of take a look at that over here right now. So our macro is attached to our distortions. Let's turn this down 4 now. So the way it's going to be going into the signal chain. So first it's going to hit an EQ, and this curve looks bizarre, I get it. And that's kind of really a very important spot because we want to filter some certain things out before it goes into the distortion. Now for here, this is kind of a lot of just listening and changing the EQ to see what really kind of comes out through the distortion, what sounds best. Now, with that being said, we're using kind of a lot here. So for this low shelf, we have 80 hertz. The gain is at -15, so quite a jump there. Downwards, that is. The Q, 0.707. The first band here is going to be at 191 hertz. Peak gain, -12.9. The Q, 123. Number 2 is going to be 1,728 hertz, the gain +7.9, and then the Q is 0.534, and so on. Number 3 is going to be 6,638 hertz, and then the gain is going to be -0.323, and the Q is at 123, and then the high shelf here is going to be around 4K, 4,000 1077 if you want to be exact. The high gain 5, and then the EQ is 0.829. Now again, these are kind of arbitrary values for this patch that I kind of felt sound best to kind of contour the sound before it starts getting distorted. Because we're going to be using 2 distortion modules with 2 different algorithms here to really kind of crank out that sound. So let's go over here to FXB and let's kind of start turning some of these off so we can kind of see the sound evolve through the different modules that it goes through. So right now, let's turn these off here. So this is basically the FX on, but all our modules are going to be disabled. We do have this reverb here, but if we look into the synth, it's going to be 0 on the send level. So ignore this reverb down here. That's kind of just on standby. So with that being said, this is kind of the dry signal before it gets affected. Now we add the EQ to this. We lose a lot of that low end, and you might think, okay, we do have that low end in the patch, but we're removing it. That's kind of strange. Yes, you are correct. So what happens here is now it goes into this first distortion module. So let's turn this on here. And it sounds the same, and that's because our macro is all the way down. That's controlling this dry wet knob here and this dry wet knob here. So let's turn this all the way up here. Let's turn this off again, so let's get a vision of what this sounds like. Now let's add the distortion here. Play something a little bit lower. Okay, now we're kind of getting somewhere. So what's happening in this module here is this dry wet is getting controlled by this distortion macro. So if we have this all the way to the bottom, then this knob's going to be all the way to the bottom, and it's getting controlled by 0.55. So a little bit more than halfway. This is going to be the distance this macro can travel within this knob. As we turn this all the way to the top, that's the maximum distortion that this macro is allowed to give. Now, with that being said, we have this drive here at 31.4 dB, and the real trick here for this exponential module here is this extra filter that comes after it. So, or technically before, because this is on pre, but you know what I'm saying. We turn this on here, we go to high pass 24, and this is going to help us cut some of the low stuff, but also boost the lows that we do want. And sometimes that can sound a little counterintuitive. We're using a high pass to get more low end, and we're doing that because we have this cutoff set at around 113 hertz, but we're increasing this resonance by 0.947. So there's going to be a little bump here, kind of what we do with our regular filters, right? We have our resonance knob and we kind of accentuate different frequencies. Here, we're using that in an opposite way to cut off the low stuff, but also give us back some of the meaty lows that we do want. So that's kind of the thought process behind that. So like I said, cutoff 113 hertz, resonance 0.947, and then this is going to be routing on pre, and this dark mode is going to be off because we don't need that. So now we have this kind of sound. So we're kind of getting somewhere, but we still need a little bit more distortion, and then we turn on the next distortion module. And that's going to make it a little bit more dirty because we do need that type of sound. Now, this is going to be in germanium for this algorithm here. And the same dry wet knob thing applies here as well. So we turn this all the way down and we look at this knob here, and this one is going to be 0.91. So we're actually giving a little bit more distortion on the second module when this is all the way to the top. So as we increase this macro, at the very top, we can see this one stops a little past halfway, but this one's almost at 100%. So really 0.91% in this case. So moving on from there, we have our drive at 30.9 dB, and we're skipping over this filter here because we already did this previously, so we don't really need to do it again. So there is basically the first effect change that happens, hits the EQ, and then that's kind of contouring the sound before it hits these distortion modules. Now we're going to FXB. So all this processing, it comes out of this distortion here, and now we're going to be going into FXB. So what's going to be happening here is we hit it with a multiband. Now, as I always say with this specific one, this is a lot to taste, kind of how you want this to sound, mixing your lows, mids, and highs, and compressing them accordingly. So with that being said, it's going to sound like this now. So right off the bat, it gives it quite an aggressive sound. Now, so for these values, the low top is going to be 66.9 over 1, and the middle 62.7 over 1, and the high 101 over 1. For the lows, 4.17 over 1, and I think that's all for the bottom bars here. Now, that's kind of moving these bars is, like I said, it's up to taste. You really have to use your ears. If you don't really want to mess with this, you can always download this patch for free in the video description below, but I thought I'd just mention that as well. And this amounts all the way to the right. Now we need to make a little bit of space for this sound. We need to put it kind of in a room, give it a little bit of tape echo, which is nice because it starts kind of changing the pitch as the delays go on. So let's turn this on here. kind of just already off the bat makes it a little bit bigger here. The time is going to be 1/8. Fine is 0 right there at the middle. The input volume, I increased it to 7.97 dB. Intensity 0.504, and the stereo spread 0.138. Our dry wet's going to be 27%, and this again is to taste. If you find that this delay is cluttering your sound up too much, you can reduce it or remove it altogether if you'd like to. Maybe use a different delay. It's totally up to you. But I felt like this one sounded pretty good for this patch. And then the classic reverb to kind of make it a little bit bigger, a little bit larger than live. Now our dry wet here for our reverb is 38%, pre-delay 20 millisecond size 1.37, decay 0.353, stereo width 0.5, the high pass frequency 200, low pass frequency 3767, and the dampening is going to be at 0.704. So now we're basically reaching a point where we have the sound created. Now, what else do we need to really make it have that 303, that acidy sound? And now that's done in the sequencer. So if you go to the sequencer tab, and let's turn this on here. So there's a couple things that really make this sound. One is obviously sequencing the notes, right? We hold down our note. Now it has this because, one, we have this scale. We're using Phrygian in this case, which is kind of popular for that. And we're using the sequence with a minimal amount of notes. And that's really the key, is minimalism in this sequence, because it's going to be repeating over and over and over again. We don't want to do some crazy, wild, different notes all the time, like some crazy arpeggios. That's going to kind of make the sound a little bit boring by doing too much. What we really want to think about is we're using the sequence and it's being repetitive, but we want to change the timbre of the sound, and that's going to help with the macros, but also with when notes play, when they don't play, and then the gate length, and maybe a little bit of slide. Kind of how they used to call accenting stuff, and that's kind of more so done with volume and resonance, but really in this case, it's going to be the trig probability and it's going to be the gate length. So if we look over here, what's going to be happening? Look at our trig probability. So in this bar, all the way at the top at 100%, it says this note will always trigger regardless. All the way at the bottom, if it's 0%, it means that note will never trigger. So this step 4, this C right here, will never be triggered. There's a little gap there. Now what we want to do is all the ones that we take out that we find is a good rhythmic feel. So step 4, this trig probability is down. Number 9 is down as well. 11 is down, 14 is down, and 16 is down. So we're actually removing 4 different steps within the sequence. Now, what we need to do to kind of band-aid that is the step prior to it. If you look on our gate length, this one's going to be 136. So it's going to be holding that note longer than a lot of the other ones, and it's going to be holding it while this one's off to kind of give us that holding kind of feeling. And you can really hear it on this number 15 right here. So our trig probability for 15 is going to be on. So we're going to hear number 15, but we're not hearing 16. But we look at 15's gate, and that's 189. So that's why you hear that dun, that like long extended note. Even though 16 is gone, it's just 15 is holding it a little bit more. So that's kind of a thing we really do have to keep in mind, is really once we make our sequence, we kind of maybe want to remove some of these notes to kind of give that slide feeling, that holding feeling, because we don't want every single note to be triggered all the time. And you can also mess around with slide if you want to as well. If you're doing some high notes or low notes and you kind of want them to slide within each other, you're more than welcome to do that. And that slide, this column over here, this row, is going to help you do that. And the rate for this is going to be 1/16, and that's pretty much it at a tempo of 134. And if you come up with kind of a cool sequence, you can kind of just mess around with these trig probabilities, the gate length, and then play around with your macros, and you get pretty close to that 303 sound. Like I said, it's not exact because it's a different synth entirely, but it's pretty much that sound. So like I said, if we're here when everything kind of drops in, let's kind of take a look and see how close we got. And there's kind of something as well that I kind of wanted to talk about. You might have seen this kind of repeat before it hits the end of the length. So that's done over here. If we look at, for example, if we look at this pattern here, and if we go to the pattern mode, and then let's kind of extend this bar or this window here a little bit. Now we have our sequence playing here, but then we have some interruptions here at an octave or 2 octaves higher, and then we have another interruption here with 1 octave higher, and it kind of just restarts the sequence at a different octave and gives a little bit more of a rhythmic feel, kind of throws off the listener a little bit because they're going to expect this sequence after a while. So you kind of do want to change things up a little bit, not just with timbre, but also maybe with some rhythmic notes in the piano roll as well. You don't want to just hold down the note the whole time and leave it there. We do want to make it a little bit more interesting. So with that being said, check out how this changes once we, let's look at our sequence here, let's hide our playlist there, and let's look at this piano roll and also watch the sequence and see how that changes. Especially there, we can kind of see it jumping back and forth, right? So this is kind of something I thought I'd mention there to kind of just a little accent to kind of change up things just a little bit there. So like I said, this patch is available for free download. If you would like to get it, just click the link in the video description below and import it into Pigments. Everything is basically set up for you. You just play around with these macro knobs, make a cool sequence in whatever key you're going to be using or whatever scale that you really want to use. And that's pretty much it. The only difference with this week, what we're going to be doing, is generally we do different arrangements every single day, and that's cool. But for this one, I kind of wanted to put together something a little bit more cohesive. So we're going to be sticking in the same session, talking about different sounds in this session, and kind of seeing how they all fit together and kind of building something, like I said, cohesive in one kind of piece here. So I thought that might be a cool idea to kind of help you out because we can learn from different kinds of patch, a pluck here, some percussion there, whatever it may be. But in this situation, we're going to be building something that kind of belongs with each other. So yeah, with that being said, thank you so much for watching, and we'll play us out with whatever we want to call this. Industrial Acid Week is what I called it. I have no idea. So here we go. Enjoy. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.